What's up guys, thanks for tuning in. I'm trying something completely different with this video. I would like to get you involved in improving Photoshop and talk about features we would love to see in future releases or updates. For this first video, I'm going to share 5 feature concepts with you that I would love to see implemented. But most importantly, I would like to get comments from you sharing your ideas. I'm going to pick a few of the best suggestions and demonstrate them in future videos. Alright, so one of the features that I would love to have in both Photoshop and Illustrator is a time-lapse recording option. Similar to what Procreate is doing, where you don't even have to think about it. It is just something that if you feel like your artwork is nice, at the end you can just export it as a video, the whole process. And in a way, these Adobe applications already have a history saved where you can go back and undo steps. And in fact, in Photoshop, we have 1,000 steps that we can set up, and I think it's the same now in Illustrator as well. So if you go into performance, history states, you can go all the way up to 1,000, although I wouldn't recommend to do that. But it means that there is the capacity to store a lot of information, recording all the steps that you are doing, but Photoshop currently is not able to turn that into a video. However, I came up with a workaround, so until we get a proper time-lapse feature, this can be useful for you as well if you ever wish to record your process. So all you need to do is to go to the window menu and choose Arrange New Window for the current document. So you have the document open in which you are going to work, and then when you choose this option, essentially what happens is that it opens up a new window, but that window is also connected to the same file. So what I would do is to put this on a second screen, or we can even just attach it here on the side so we can see them side by side. And then essentially what you do is you work in one of these windows, but you record the other one. That means that if I zoom in and out in this one while I'm working on it, the other one won't follow those changes in the view. So panning and zooming around won't be visible there. But once I start moving things around, as you can see on the right side, that's going to be also visible. But it's quite nice because it also doesn't show things like selections. So again, you don't see that on the right side. Even things like quick mask or masking, you won't see on the right side. And also when you select something and use free transform, the bounding box won't show up on the other window. The changes, the transform changes will, but not the bounding box. So it's a very clear way to record the time-lapse video, but it's not ideal. As I said, you would need to have a second screen, and you have to make sure that the screen capture application is going to record the right area. And of course, you have to make sure that you start recording before you start the process. But once again, if all this was implemented into Photoshop and Illustrator, it would be much easier. By the way, the new window option is also available in Illustrator. So if you like this workaround, you can test it out in either of these applications. So if you think this is a good idea and this is something that you would like to see, let me know in the comment section, and also maybe just give me an idea where would you place it and how would you want this feature to work. I think it should be an option that you can set up in the preferences, whether it should be saved or not by default. And maybe there should be an indication somewhere on the top right in the options bar that it's currently recording. And if there is a time-lapse feature, it would also be cool to control the speed of it. So again, something that could be in the preferences somewhere. But let's move on to the second feature that I would love to have in Photoshop, and that is an improved free transform. Now I know that the Photoshop team is already working on this, and hopefully we will see it soon, and we don't even have to wait for the next big release for this to be implemented. But until it comes out, I still would like to talk about it because there's a few things I hope they will fix at the same time while introducing this feature. So you all probably familiar with the free transform tool, or just the show transform controls. Whenever you use the move tool, you can have that option on, with which you can scale things around. And since CC 2019, we don't have to hold down the shift key by default to avoid distorting our selected layers. which by the way is quite a controversial update. I remember when I was at Adobe Max and Terry White showed this, the audience was crazy about it and everyone was so happy. But afterwards on the forums, I can see a lot of people are complaining about it, and even myself find it hard to still get used to it. So I still hold down the shift key and then I realize, oh, I don't have to. So the problem with it, I think, is that it is not a preference that can be turned on and off. I think it definitely should be there in the preferences. And also, if there is a feature like this that's changed, like a very core feature that everyone's used to, it should be across the whole application. So it should be applied to everything. And also not only within Photoshop, but it should be added or set up the same way in the other applications. So I find it really confusing to have no shift key necessary in Photoshop, but then when I'm in Illustrator, I have to hold the shift key, or the same thing in InDesign. So it should be across every application, I think, if they are making this change. And not to mention there is even inconsistency within Photoshop itself. So it works without the shift key on text and images, but when you work with shape layers and you start using the transform feature, you still have to hold down the shift key to make sure it's not going to be distorted. So as I said, it's very confusing at the moment. And it messes up a lot of other things as well, like the perspective distortion, which used to be a simple command or control key. Now, if I use that feature, it actually doesn't work the same way. So I think it is doing the other transform feature, which is called skew or distort, and not the perspective. So now on Mac, to be able to do this, I have to hold down Command or Control Shift to be able to access the perspective distortion. I think again on PC is slightly different. So things changed in CC 2019, but in my opinion, it just got a bit more confusing than before. But the real reason why I'm mentioning the transform feature is because I think the warp mode is something that can be improved a lot. And I'm going to show you exactly what I mean. So when you are in free transform and you switch to the warp feature, you get this mesh and you can use it to make your distortions, which is great and it works quite well. And it is really useful to have these handles on the corners, but why don't we have these handles here in the anchor points? So within the mesh itself, or even on these points here on the side. Why do we only have them on the corners? Also, imagine if you could have more division in your warp, so you could have more columns and rows, and each of those sections can be adjusted without affecting the rest of the mesh. Of course, we have Puppet Warp in Photoshop, which is really cool, and that creates a very intricate mesh on your layers. But I think the Warp tool needs to catch up with the Puppet Warp technology and definitely needs some improvement. Even things like selecting a group in Photoshop and using the free transform, you can't use the warp. So you are stuck in free transform. You can't do warping on groups. Now, just to show you in Procreate, having the same file open, you can see I have a group of layers selected. When I use the selection tool and I'm in the warp feature and having the advanced mesh turned on the bottom left, I can do the distortion on multiple layers at the same time. But not only that, notice that I have handles for each of the points on the mesh. So if I want, I can just select this one here, and it almost feels like I am animating this monster and the monster is turning towards us. So just simply having this handle here makes a huge difference. So what I would love to see in Photoshop, to have something like this for the warp tool, but also have the ability to set up how many columns and rows I need in my warp mesh. And also to be able to use the warp on multiple layers at the same time. Is that a lot to ask? Well, hopefully we will see these features implemented soon. But again, let me know in the comment section what you think about the free transform and also the whole shift key controversy. What's your take on it? Now, here's another thing that I know technically it is very complicated to implement, but from a user perspective, it would be amazing to have. And that is to be able to edit smart objects in context. Now, let me explain what that means. If you're not familiar with smart objects, they are layers that you can resize without losing quality. but that's just in a nutshell because they can do a lot more than that. So for example, if I make this layer bigger and then smaller again, I'm not losing quality on the way, because Photoshop saves for each smart object a backup file, which is embedded normally in your Photoshop document or linked if you are using linked smart objects. And to be able to access the source of your smart object, what you need to do is to double click on the thumbnail of the smart object layer. And then it opens up as a whole separate document, and it even has its own tab. And here you can have layers, you can even have smart objects inside smart objects. And it is a really cool feature and one of the most important options to be able to work non-destructively in Photoshop. But my point is that it is sometimes hard to see what you're working on when a separate document opens up. So for example, here, if I go back to the main document, you can see I have a couple of smart objects, and when I turn them on and off, we can see where they are. But if, for example, I want to edit this smart object, I double click on it. Again, I see it without the rest of the composition. So it opens up, and whenever I make my changes, I just hope that it's going to turn out fine in the main composition, but I don't actually see how it looks. So for example, if I move this guy down a bit, I can only hope that it's going to work in the main composition, but I would only see it updating if I save my smart object. So go to File, Save, then close this window, and then I can see it. One cool thing is though, of course, is that you can undo and redo these changes from the main file without going back and forth between the two documents. So I can just undo, redo, and compare it. But imagine how cool it would be to be able to see all the changes in the same document. And the way I think it could work is something very similar to how isolation mode works in Illustrator, meaning that you could just have a smart object selected, and if you double click on it in your window, it would fade out everything else, and you will be able to see only the layers within the smart object, but in the same document. And so you would still see it in the context of the main composition. Technically, it could still be a separate file, but I don't need to see that file being open. It's enough if Photoshop keeps track of it as a separate file, but I would like to see it overlaid on my main composition. So if you're not familiar with isolation mode, let me just show you quickly here in Illustrator. So let's say here's an object. If I want to isolate this from the rest of the design, I can just double click on it, and then everything grays out, and this is the only object that I can make changes to. So it locks in a way everything else, and that's the only thing visible both in my layers panel and here in my document. And similarly to entering isolation, if I double click somewhere outside, I go back to normal editing mode. So that's what I would love to see here in Photoshop. And it's interesting that maybe you had never thought about this, but double clicking while having a layer selected doesn't actually do anything. So there's a real gap there in terms of interaction, which currently only works with type. So if you have a type layer, double clicking on it enters into editing mode, but with normal images or smart object, nothing happens. But there is actually an isolate feature in Photoshop, and I don't know whether you know about this, but let's say I right click here. Notice that there is the isolate layers option. When I do that, the only thing happens that now I don't see my other layers, only this one. But if I Command or Control click on another layer, or if you have auto select and you accidentally click on another layer, that also appears in the layers panel. So this feature is in a way helping you when you have complex documents and lots of layers to concentrate on certain layers that you can quickly switch between without deleting all the other layers. So it can be useful sometimes, but to be honest, even though I use Photoshop all the time and I use it on complex designs, I don't actually find the isolate feature or the current isolate feature really useful. But I would love to find out whether you actually are using this feature or not, or whether you actually heard about it or not. So again, let me know in the comment section what you think about this, and also, most importantly, whether you think the in-context smart object editing would be something that would help you in your work. Feature number 4 is for anyone who normally works from references when creating a new design. Now, this is mainly for digital artists who would illustrate and draw in Photoshop and need some references to see on the side, but it can also be useful for retouchers and graphic designers, whoever needs to have some kind of visual feed while working on a new design. And at the moment, there is no better way of doing this than either getting a plugin or a separate application, or having, I don't know, Pinterest open on a separate monitor, because Photoshop doesn't actually have a reference panel. But imagine if it had one. Similar to the navigator panel, you could just open it up on the side and drag and drop images into it even from your browser, and it would stay there almost like a separate document, but it would be independent from documents because it is a panel. And what would be really cool is if you could move things around, obviously, and resize them, just like in a Photoshop document, even rotate them, maybe, that might be useful. And also, once you have multiple images, to have the ability to move things up and down, so set something in front or behind your other references. So I just created this little simulation here, so the way I imagine this could work. And there might be a plugin for this that has already a separate panel for references, but I haven't found one that works really well for both Mac and PC. But again, let me know if you know of something. Of course, it's always better to have something native and built into the application than to rely on a plugin. So I would love to see this implemented in Photoshop. And please make sure you like this video and share it if you found any of these features useful, because then there's more chance that Adobe developers will find this video and they will start thinking about it and how to implement it. And just as a side note, I wonder how many of you remember the feature called Mini Bridge. So Bridge is like a sidecar application to Photoshop, and it has been around for quite a long time, since CS2, I think, or CS version it was introduced. And there was also a time when we had the Mini Bridge panel, and in a way that worked quite similarly to this. And I actually used it for putting some files in a folder, and I had Mini Bridge panel open on the side. But since they introduced the libraries panel, they got rid of Mini Bridge, and now again I'm stuck and I don't have a panel that I can use for keeping my references visible all time. And last but not least, I wanted to talk about the pasteboard, which again I feel like is not handled the best way in Photoshop compared to Illustrator or InDesign. So in both of those other applications, we have a proper pasteboard on which we can work, while in Photoshop, by default, the pasteboard is something that we don't really see. So if I make an object and it's placed on the side, I don't actually see the missing parts of it. And there's no way that I know of I can see this unless I use artboards, and I'm going to show you that in a second. But in the normal editing mode, the normal layer setup, I won't be able to see it. So if I drag it all the way out, the only way I found that I can check where this layer is by Command or Control clicking on the thumbnail, which will then create a little marquee selection, so that reveals where this content is. But otherwise, I would just have to keep moving it around until I find where it was placed. And it actually happens quite often with me, because I work with lots of layers, and sometimes I make them really big that I can't really see where they end up. And there's so many different cases I can't even think of right now where I feel like it would be great to have this functionality. Also, sometimes I actually lose layers that are placed outside of my canvas, and if I use the crop tool and set it to delete crop pixels, then they will completely be deleted. And by the way, when we are in the crop tool, that in a way can show us parts of our canvas that are currently not visible. So there is an option called delete cropped pixels. If I choose that and apply this crop, then next time when I go back to the crop tool, now I won't see those details that were previously visible. I will only see the details that I'm left with. Plus, if I had a smart object like that balloon, it will also keep a separate part for that outside of my canvas. But once again, it is really hard to keep track of what's on the pasteboard. While in Illustrator, if I just switch back here quickly, I can easily move things outside of my artboard, and there's a huge space here where I can just move things around and keep things ready whenever I want to work with them, but still also keep them visible. InDesign does it even better, where you can just use the W shortcut and switch between showing or hiding the pasteboard, which is the switching between normal and preview modes. I would love to have something like that in Photoshop, where I could very quickly show what's on the pasteboard and hide it when I don't need to see them. But I mentioned working with artboards in Photoshop can change how the pasteboard works. And again, this is something I wonder whether you are familiar with and whether you use the artboard feature often. Unless you are a UX or UI designer, I don't think you necessarily need this feature, but it is actually quite useful. So when you switch to artboard tool by right-clicking on the move tool, you can draw an artboard around your current area or canvas. And once you do that, the layers panel will start to group things based on which artboard your layers are on. So notice now, if I use my move tool and I select the balloon, it's actually outside of artboard 1. So it is on the pasteboard, but now it became visible. And once I move it into the artboard, it's automatically placed inside the artboard. Once again, when I drag it out completely, that's when it appears and it's moved outside of the artboard. If I have multiple artboards, so I'm just going to create another artboard here, then again, wherever this balloon goes, the changes will follow in the layers panel. So now it's on artboard 2. If I move it into artboard 1, it appears there. If I move it completely outside, then it is on the pasteboard, but on a visible pasteboard. So why can't we have this functionality normally without working with artboards if it's already there? Of course, there's a couple of things that should be implemented as well. And I don't know why, but for some reason, currently, when something is on the pasteboard during working with artboards, there is no proper aliasing or edge detail. It is really pixelated, as you can see it. So if I move this back here, it looks perfect. But when I move it onto the pasteboard, it looks really messy and pixelated. So there's obviously a couple of things that would need to be refined, but in a way, the functionality is already there. It's just not something that we can access by default. So once again, I can't stress this enough. I'm really relying on your feedback. So make sure you use the comment section. Even if you don't normally comment, this is the time that you can explain what other features you would like to see in Photoshop, or if you have any ideas or suggestions about the features that I mentioned. And I really hope these videos will help to shape the future of these applications. But as I said before, my word on its own doesn't count much. But if we come all together and discuss these things, there's a much higher chance that we will see some progress. Let us know in the comment section what would you like us to cover next time on this series. Click on the link in the description or the join button to become a member if you want to work on future projects with us and see the whole design or illustration process live. Thanks a lot for watching. Like and share this video if you enjoyed it. Have fun learning, guys, and I will see you in the next one.